Greetings and welcome to Lobes and Robes, How Neuroscience Can Change the World. This podcast is sponsored by the American University Center for Neuroscience and Behavior and explores the links between neuroscience and key policy questions today. I'm Susan Carl, a professor of law at American University Washington College of Law, and I will help lead discussions throughout our series along with Dr. Terry Davidson, Director of the Center for Neuroscience and Behavior at American University and a distinguished professor of neuroscience here. This podcast is for anyone interested in how scientific discovery can make the world a better place. Thanks for listening.
It's our great pleasure to host Dr. Alison Sylvetsky as our guest on this episode of Lobes and Robes podcast. Dr. Sylvetsky is an associate professor in the Department of Exercise and Nutrition Sciences and is director of the Bachelor of Science in Nutrition undergraduate degree program at the Milken Institute School of Public Health at George Washington University in Washington, D.C. She is also an affiliate faculty member at the Sumner M. Redstone Global Center for Prevention and Wellness and is a special volunteer at the National Institute for Child Health and Development in the intramural research program of the National Institutes of Health. Dr. Sylvetsky's research aims to improve understanding of both obesity and diabetes in youth. Integrating knowledge of behavior and physiology, Dr. Sylvetsky conducts research in both the laboratory and community settings. Her studies of the health effects of consuming sugar-sweetened beverages and non-nutritive artificial sweeteners by children have been especially impactful, as she is the principal investigator on grants from the National Institutes of Health that support her continuing work on this topic. Dr. Sylvetsky will talk with us today about her research, about controversies related to the consumption of artificial sweeteners, and about the recent guidance provided by the World Health Organization about the use of artificial sweeteners for weight control. Dr. Sylvetsky, thank you for joining us on Lobes and Robes today.
Thank you so much for having me. It's my pleasure to be here today.
And I will also say we're just so pleased to have you on the podcast to talk about your research. Maybe you could start off by describing what initially got you interested in the research that you're doing on non-sugar sweeteners.
Yeah, so it's actually a little bit of an interesting story, at least I think so. I did my graduate work at Emory University under the mentorship of Dr. Miriam Voss, who's a pediatric gastroenterologist and hepatologist. And while I was doing one of my first research rotations in her lab, I realized that clinically, the children that she was seeing that had non-alcoholic fatty liver disease or were at risk for non-alcoholic fatty liver disease were being advised to replace consumption of sugar-sweetened beverages with diet beverages that contain non-nutritive or artificial sweeteners. And that's really what got me interested in this topic, was to try to understand the question of, are these non-nutritive or artificial sweeteners, are they really helpful for kids who have obesity, who are at risk for non-alcoholic fatty liver disease, or who are trying to minimize the risk of other metabolic complications.
And what did your research show on that?
Well, that was really just kind of the beginning of my interest in this area. That particular research rotation had nothing to do with non-nutritive sweeteners, but was really focused more on sugary drinks and doing a retrospective chart review around sugary drink counseling in the clinical setting. But that was really what got the wheels turning for me and made me start to think about, well, how are these consumed in kids? What percentage of the population of children and adults consume these non-nutritive or artificial sweeteners? And of course, what do they do in terms of their metabolic and health effects? And so that led to a bunch of questions, which really laid the groundwork for my subsequent dissertation work. And then really for the last nearly 15 years now of research on this topic.
And what kinds of studies have you done? What types of studies have you done? And what are you continuing to do now in your research program?
So we've done a lot of different studies on this topic using different methodologies and to answer different questions related not only to how these sweeteners act in the body, but also to understand more about the behavior of how they're consumed. And so this work has included analyzing consumption and trends in consumption of non-nutritive or artificial sweeteners using publicly available data, for example, data from the National Health and Nutrition Examination Survey. We've also done work looking at parents' perceptions and consumer perceptions in general of non-nutritive or artificial sweeteners and how they're used in the context of daily life. We've also done work that's experimental studies looking at acute metabolic effects of non-nutritive sweeteners. For example, how does drinking a diet soda before an oral glucose tolerance test or before having a sugary beverage, how does that impact the body's glucose and insulin responses? And we've also done work more recently looking at chronic or repeated consumption of non-nutritive and artificial sweeteners to understand how they may affect the gut microbiome, how they affect metabolic risk factors when they're consumed for a period of weeks or months. And we've also really become interested in the area of early life exposure. And we've done several studies investigating the transmission of various non-nutritive or artificial sweeteners in breast milk, as well as in amniotic fluid. And now we actually just received funding from the National Institutes of Health to start a much larger randomized controlled trial to understand how consumption of non-nutritive or artificial sweeteners affect pregnant women's health during pregnancy, as well as the infant's health once the infant is born and following them up for 6 months postpartum. So we're really excited about that work to be able to understand not only the transmission of these sweeteners via breast milk, for example, but to start to understand how this early life exposure may actually impact the infant's health.
So, Allison, your research is impressive both in its depth and its breadth. And I'd like to get into some of the details of some of your studies. But first, I'd like to ask you about a recent paper. You just published a paper in the Journal of American Medical Association Pediatrics, Non-Sugar Sweeteners, Time for Transparency and Caution. Could you describe the views you expressed in that paper?
Yeah, so there were really one of the main reasons that we wanted to write this viewpoint. This was not an original research article, but it was a viewpoint that was recently published in JAMA Pediatrics, as you mentioned, was that we're seeing around the world this trend where, due to the emphasis on reducing added sugars, because of course we know that excess intake of added sugars is not good for our health and is associated with a variety of unfavorable health outcomes, that there's been more and more use of non-sugar sweeteners or artificial sweeteners in the food supply. And this isn't just in diet beverages or in sweetener packets, but this is in many different product categories spanning breakfast cereals and yogurts and frozen foods and desserts, basically across a countless number of products, and including in places where you wouldn't expect necessarily to see non-nutritive sweeteners. We've been seeing them showing up. And so this is concerning from our perspective because there's so much uncertainty about their metabolic and health effects in general, with a particular scarcity of evidence in children. And as we've seen, especially policies, for example, front package labeling, policies focused on added sugar, there's been an increase in the presence of non-nutritive sweeteners, including in products that are widely consumed among children. And so that was really the emphasis or the impetus for writing this commentary or viewpoint, was just that this is happening, whether we like it or not, this is happening, but we really don't know a lot about what this means for children's health. And there is concerning evidence that's come out in adults, which really, from our perspective, means that we should be more cautious when it comes to widely exposing children to them, especially before more research has been conducted.
So, Allison, when you're talking about the widespread use of this, is it the case that when it's advertised, for example, on a package or something, no sugar added, that you're likely to find artificial sweeteners in there if it's a sweet product?
Yeah, absolutely. So we've done some work on this previously, showing that, we did it was a relatively small study outside of a grocery store where we gave parents an array of products and asked them what they thought contained non-nutritive sweeteners versus what actually did. And what we found, and this was over 10 years ago when the food and beverage landscape was actually quite different. There's a far more widespread presence of these sweeteners now than there was, I guess this was published in 2014. So literally 10 years ago. And what we found was parents really couldn't recognize products that contain them. And there's been more recent work that's shown the same thing, that even when parents see the ingredients list, oftentimes parents can't recognize non-nutritive sweeteners in food and beverage products. And so while they're certainly more likely to be in products that are labeled diet or no sugar added or that have sort of these various different nutrition related claims, they're also in products that don't have any of these claims. And one of the things I actually joke about with my own colleagues is that even, as someone who studies this topic, I've actually been tripped up by this before, where I've grabbed something that I can distinctly remember the product, which was an 100-calorie pack of cocoa roasted almonds. And I was shocked once I actually opened the package to eat them that it contained non-nutritive or artificial sweeteners. And so even someone who studies this area, sometimes I have to think twice before, realizing that something has a non-nutritive sweeteners.
And they often put chemical names in the ingredients list as well, which a lot of people may not be familiar with the chemical name of the sweetener.
Correct.
You mentioned that there's concerning evidence in adults about the use of these artificial sweeteners, and I'm wondering if you could just kind of summarize that. What is that evidence?
That's a great question. And this is evidence that's coming not only from mechanistic studies. So there's been studies, including some of Terry, your own work, that's shown, in rodent models, for example, that these sweeteners, particularly in the case of saccharin, may have some paradoxical effects and could actually potentially be detrimental in terms of energy intake, glucose intolerance, etc. But more recently, there's been studies in humans, both prospective cohort studies that have very large sample sizes and long follow-ups have shown that consumption of diet beverages or consumption of products with non-nutritive sweeteners are associated with an increase of risk of metabolic diseases, for example, type 2 diabetes and heart disease. And there's also been studies that are typically smaller clinical trials that have shown that consumption of non-nutritive sweeteners can actually lead to changes in the gut microbiome and induce glucose intolerance, as well as certain non-nutritive sweeteners. For example, sucralose consumption has been shown to lead to insulin resistance or reductions in insulin sensitivity. And so these risk factors would be likely to then lead to development of metabolic diseases, for example, type 2 diabetes.
So, Allison, one of the things you mentioned that I've done some research, and we did research in rats, and our particular studies, and a few others have found that there's actually an increased tendency for animals to gain weight when they've been exposed to artificial sweeteners, along with other normal aspects of their meals. But one of the things that has intrigued reviewers and many people is that when you give artificial sweeteners, typically you're substituting them for high-calorie sweeteners. Why wouldn't you expect to have reduced body weight based on just a difference in calories? It seems like it's counterintuitive. Why would you fail to lose weight, or why would you even gain weight when you do that kind of substitution?
Yeah, well, certainly, I don't think anyone is arguing, energy, the energy balance equation, right? So certainly if you reduce your calories by consuming non-nutritive sweeteners as a one-to-one replacement for added sugar, then it would be expected that there would be weight loss. And that's been shown repeatedly in randomized controlled trials in adults, where typically a sugar-sweetened beverage is replaced with diet beverage, and then generally there is a modest reduction in energy intake and modest weight loss. But those are in these highly controlled trials and often in combination with other approaches to lose weight, for example, behavioral support around weight loss. And this one-to-one replacement, while that may be a way to lower energy intake and lose weight, this is not likely how these are being used in the context of real life, given that now these sweeteners are not only in a diet beverage, for example, that might be used to replace sort of a sugar-sweetened equivalent, so a Diet Coke for a regular Coke as an example, but we're seeing these in English muffins and in oatmeals and in cereals. So that's not the behavior the behavior that's being tested isn't necessarily the behavior that is playing out in real life. And so that is one reason. And then in addition, weight is one health outcome that we're interested in, but also there are potential independent effects of these sweeteners on cardiometabolic outcomes that may not necessarily be explained by body weight. For example, changes in gut microbiome or direct effects potentially on glucose insulin homeostasis, for example. So we have to be thinking beyond just body weight. But your point is well taken that if there's truly a replacement that leads to a sustained negative energy balance or a deficit in energy that's being created by very careful replacement. But what's been really interesting to us is we've done analyses looking at cross-sectional data, for example, in the National Health and Nutrition Examination Survey. And what we've seen repeatedly is that energy intake among people who drink diet beverages or beverages with non-nutritive sweeteners is not significantly lower than those who consume sugar-sweetened beverages. And when you look at sweetened beverage consumers, and we actually did this analysis in kids, irrespective of whether this is sweetened beverages that are sugary or sweetened beverages that contain non-nutritive sweeteners, the daily energy intake is higher compared with children who consume only unsweetened beverages and not sugar-sweetened or non-nutritive sweetener-containing beverages.
That's very interesting.
Do you have any sense of why that is? Is there a theory that you're working with, or is it unexplained at this point?
There are certainly hypotheses, and this would include potential changes in taste preferences due to early exposure. There's a hypothesis that having these, especially in childhood, may lead to development of taste preferences that would encourage consumption of other sweet foods and beverages, which also tend to be highly caloric. That has not been really well tested in experimental studies, but that is certainly a hypothesis. There are also, just again, thinking about the behavior and thinking about where these non-nutritive sweeteners are found, you're not going to find sucralose in an apple, right? Because it's an apple. And this is it's a silly example, but consumption of these sweeteners, right, is typically we find these in food, right, which are typically ultra processed foods. And of course, this is a giant category, and that would go on I don't want to go on a tangent to go into this topic, which is also very timely and debated, but the types of foods that these are in often also are high in other nutrients of public health concern.
I had another question. I'm wondering whether the concerns that you identified, are they mostly about the artificial sweeteners? And what about sort of the natural non-nutritive sweeteners like stevia? Are the same concerns raised there?
That's a great question. And this is something that is, I think, critical to really understand, which is a major research gap in the field right now, is that the vast majority of work that's been done in this area has referred to, the same way that I'm referring to them right now, non-nutritive or artificial sweeteners or whatever of the many names that you want to use. But they're typically referred to and often studied as a class. And that's because whether it's sucralose or aspartame or saccharin or stevia, what they have in common is that they're potently sweet and they contain no or few calories, and therefore they're often used as replacements for sugar or added sugar in foods and beverages. But when you actually look at the chemical structures even of these compounds, they are extremely heterogeneous. And therefore, they may have different effects. And that's something that, as a field, we're only just beginning to scratch the surface on, because it depends on how they work. And that's something that is not fully understood. And so if the mechanism through which they act has to do with sweetness or sweet taste receptors, for example, then we would expect them to work similarly, whether it's stevia, right, a plant-derived so-called natural sweetener, or sucralose, for example, a synthetic sweetener. But there are likely also sweetener-specific mechanisms, which would mean they might have different effects. And they also, even beyond their chemical structures or related to their chemical structures, the way they act in the body is different. The way they are absorbed, the way some are metabolized, some are not. Some are excreted primarily in the urine, some are excreted primarily in the stool. So they're different compounds, but most of the research, especially the observational research, by and large, tends to group them together.
So let me ask a question about, well, I guess what you're saying is right now, we don't have a basis for distinguishing among, say, good artificial sweeteners versus, or non-nutritive sweeteners versus so-called ones that aren't so good. The data aren't out there yet. One of the things, though, is that World Health Organization, they issued a recommendation against the use of non-nutritive sweeteners, and this was for weight loss. And the recommendation has generated a lot of controversy. I was wondering what you think about this recommendation. Should it be heeded by people, or did they overstep?
It's a great question. And The recommendation by the World Health Organization, as you mentioned, said that these sweeteners, again, as a class, are not recommended for weight management or prevention of non-communicable diseases. And in order to develop that recommendation, the conclusion was based on a meta-analysis that was done, so looking at results of a very large body of evidence. And some of the reasons that the World Health Organization came to that conclusion based on what they wrote in the recommendation had to do with some factors in addition to just the evidence. Of course, the evidence that exists was critical, but also kind of this acknowledgement that non-sugar sweeteners are not, and that's how they call them, non-sugar sweeteners, as opposed to non-nutritive or low-calorie, which is why I use that language, but that non-sugar sweeteners are not essential dietary components, right? They don't have nutritional value. And so they took a very cautious approach in that because there is evidence of harm, which they highlighted from primarily observational studies, and that even though there is evidence that shows that these may have short-term benefits when it comes to, replacement, as we were talking about earlier in some randomized controlled trials, when it came to weight-related outcomes like energy intake or small amounts of weight loss, that the long-term benefits had not been shown, yet there's evidence of potential long-term harm. And basically, therefore, given that these are not contributing anything to the diet, that they recommended that these not be consumed. My view is that this recommendation was appropriate because you can replace, and this is what they said in their guideline, that, things with foods and beverages with added sugars can be replaced with foods and beverages that have less sugar or that are unsweetened, but that don't necessarily have to contain these non-sugar sweeteners. So there's other ways to lower sugar beyond simply replacing it with non-sugar sweeteners. I was a bit surprised that there wasn't a little bit more emphasis on some of the findings of the shorter term randomized controlled trials, showing again, when it's done very carefully, that replacement of added sugar with non-nutritive sweeteners has been shown to have some short-term benefits, but they really relied on this, the foundation here that the long-term evidence isn't there. And so therefore this approach or this guideline was cautious, and it also was conditional. And that was because, the evidence overall was quite weak. And also, this is something where there are gaps in the evidence. And so that recommendation was conditional because it's not definitive.
And do you think people should heed that recommendation just on an individual basis? Should we be trying to steer clear of all of these substances?
I think, on an individual level, that's very hard to say because people have different ways of choosing foods and beverages. People have different preferences. People have different, health conditions or risk factors. And so on an individual level, I would be hesitant to really answer that question. But I think on a population level, we should be heeding this guidance in terms of let's try to reduce the sugar, obviously, in our diet. And that's not necessarily an individual thing as much as it's also, this whole policy systems environment that needs to help support people, right, in lowering sugar. But I agree with the guidance that it would be best and most prudent for people to choose unsweetened alternatives, for example, plain water, even sparkling water, less, unsweetened yogurt instead of a sugary one, right? And so there are options out there that don't require using non-sugar sweeteners. And so I do think that, there's certainly no harm in following this recommendation. And that's why I would take a cautious approach.
So, Allison, there is this controversy, and you refer to random controlled trials maybe having different effects when it's measured over the short term compared to what you might find over the long term. Is there a methodology that can provide us with, how should I say, a stronger basis for making conclusions about artificial sweeteners? Random control trials are the gold standard quite often. That's the way they're portrayed. Do you think that's the case? Or how would you think we should approach this problem in identifying actually what these effects are long-term and short-term with artificial sweeteners or non-nutritive sweeteners?
Yeah, I think we need more randomized controlled trials that are well designed and that include, a diverse sample of individuals that reflect, people that have different metabolic risk factors, people that have different dietary patterns, right? There's a lot of questions and they might be quite nuanced how these work and how maybe it's helpful for some people and not for others. And that's something, again, that we're really just scratching the surface on. But a lot of the work that's been done to date that are in randomized controlled trials have been largely, almost entirely with adults, with a couple exceptions, and also are generally using diet beverages and or using capsules. And so that, while that is informative, it certainly doesn't capture the vast number of different types of products that contain these, and also the very different behaviors and perceptions and all these kind of behavioral considerations that would go into some of these choices in real life. And so I think we need to design randomized controlled trials, first of all, that better capture how these are consumed in real life and in the present day, where we're seeing just more and more of these sweeteners in the food supply, not just in the United States, but around the world. And also, there's a lot of outcomes that have really been overlooked in a lot of these randomized controlled trials. There's quite a bit of evidence on energy intake, weight, adiposity, but really very little in terms of metabolic risk factors. For example, glucose homeostasis, inflammatory cytokines, lipid profiles, gut microbiome, right? All of these other outcomes need further study. And then in addition, one of the areas that our group is really focused on is, again, this early life exposure. And so thinking about studying these in critical life stages, like pregnancy, like during lactation, in children. And so those are also just large gaps in the existing evidence right now. And I think that we need to have randomized controlled trials that address some of those gaps.
I'm wondering, how is the food industry reacting to the evidence that is there? You pointed out it's still in the process of being developed, but it kind of surprises me that they're increasing the use of these products in light of the uncertainty about their safety. So I think most people assume that anything the FDA has approved, it is likely to be safe. And so people are thinking when they see these products on the shelves, oh, this must be safe because it's using products the FDA has approved. And I'm wondering, is that the right way to think about this? And also, do you think the FDA should be more aggressive in regulating some of the use of these non-nutritive substances?
We do not know how much would be too much or too little to have an effect on metabolic health.
It seems to me that maybe the FDA could be a little more cautious here. It could require something like labeling to say the metabolic effects of continued use of these substances is unclear, especially as to children, or that there would be ways to be a little more proactive here before we end up discovering down the road that more should have been done. I'm wondering, what do you think about that? If you were to write the recommendation to the FDA about how they should handle this, would you urge them to be a little more aggressive?
Yeah, so that's exactly really the point that we were trying to convey with our viewpoint that was recently published in JAMA Pediatrics, which is that we are acknowledging that there is not clear evidence of harm, but there's also not clear evidence of benefit, and there are concerns. And so, yes, I do feel that we should be more cautious, and I think some of the ways to do that would be, for a start, requiring some sort of disclosure of the amounts of these various sweeteners that are in food and beverage products, because since we are not able to access that information because it's not publicly disclosed, it's very hard to it's actually impossible really to quantify how much people are consuming at a population level, which makes it very hard to understand, how much may be causing or leading to some unfavorable effects versus how much might be, unlikely to cause any sort of harm. And so that's why the question that you asked before was actually quite hard to answer, is because we don't have that information. So I think one thing would be disclosure of the quantities. So, there are this many milligrams of aspartame in this product, or at least making that available to researchers or to government, surveillance or something, so that we have a better idea in terms of those estimates. But then also, yes, based on our work with parents and again, other work that's been done recently, people just aren't aware that they're consuming products or providing products that have these various non-nutritive sweeteners in them. And so, having more transparency around that these are contained in the product and allowing people to make those informed decisions, whether that is to consume or not to consume it, would be very helpful, especially when it comes to products that are consumed by children. And so, yes, I think there are certainly actions that could be taken in the spirit of being cautious.
So, Allison, I have two grandchildren, 2 years old and 3 years old. Now, we know that they probably shouldn't have a whole lot of sugar. what should I recommend to their parents with respect to consumption of artificial sweeteners, sugars, or nothing, no sweeteners at all? What would your recommendation be?
Yeah, I mean, I think we have to think about this as, we have to think about the whole diet, right? And so a little bit of added sugar, well, granted, not if you're under 2, but according to the recommendations, but, a little bit of sweetness in the diet is part of enjoying food. And so I certainly wouldn't, say to avoid sweetness or avoid sugar at all costs. Certainly not. That seems unreasonable. But I think on a day-to-day basis, really trying to provide children and young children especially with unsweetened alternatives. For example, plain yogurt, right, instead of sweetened yogurt, or, exposing them to unsweetened milk and water early in life, right? I mean, kids learn from a very early age. These things get incorporated into their diets for longer term. And so I think trying to really focus on those unsweetened foods and beverages, and of course, fresh fruits and vegetables, and, all the kind of traditional dietary guidance. But I don't think it's an all or nothing, but I also think that certainly we should be focused on providing fresh and unsweetened or kind of minimally sweetened foods, especially for young children. And I completely understand your challenge, in making these sort of recommendations to, like, for example, your grandchildren, because I have young kids too. And I mean, my 2-year-old loves plain yogurt. And so it's just funny because we exposed him to that. He's never had strawberry yogurt, and therefore he just asks for more and more yogurt when it's plain unsweetened yogurt because he loves it. And that's what he's used to.
Yes, I've seen that. Actually, Elizabeth Capaldi was my advisor when I was a PhD student. She did a lot of research on exposing kids to green vegetables and so on. And I was never a big green vegetable fan, but apparently just experience with them makes you like them. And starting out early, I guess, as what you're saying is there's certainly reason to believe that's true.
Well, I hate to be the one to say this, but I think we're running out of time. And so maybe we could just wrap up by asking you what your future holds. What are your future research plans, and what are the priority issues that you're going to be focusing on as you go forward?
Yeah, well, thanks so much for having me today. It's been a great conversation with you, and we're really excited about our future research. We actually have a lot going on in my group right now on this topic. And I think the kind of what I alluded to earlier is what I'm really most excited about is this exciting opportunity that we have to conduct the first randomized controlled trial on this topic in pregnant women, where we're actually doing a study that will be starting soon. We will be randomizing them to either avoid them during pregnancy and lactation only, or to continue usual behavior. And so all that to say, we are really excited to understand how the removal of these various sweeteners may impact both the mother's health as well as the infant's health. And so this study will follow women throughout pregnancy and 6 months postpartum. And we're excited to start on that work. The funding actually just came through earlier this month. And so we will be getting that started soon and are really excited about those results. But I think bigger picture, just this area of early life exposure is something that is really lacking in terms of the evidence and is critically important. And so that's really where we plan to focus.
Well, thank you so much, Allison. It was really a interesting, stimulating conversation and informative. And I wish you best of luck with your research, particularly this grant that's coming up. Very interesting questions. I'll be looking forward to seeing some of the data.
Thank you.
Thank you so much for being on the podcast.
Well, that's it for this podcast episode. Thanks very much for listening. And as always, we welcome your feedback at neuroscience.policy@american.edu. We hope you'll join us again for our next episode. And do let us know if there's anything in particular you'd like to hear more about.